Dakota Territory, late summer of 1883. Klaus Richter moved with a rhythm that belonged to another continent. He was not swinging an axe to fell trees, nor was he stretching hides. He was wrestling stones from the prairie soil, great flat-faced slabs of granite that others cursed and plowed around. He hauled them on a stone boat pulled by his weary ox, one grinding journey at a time, to the small plot he'd claimed. There, he was not building a cabin. He was building something monstrous, something that defied the logic of the frontier. He was laying the foundation for a house with walls that would be 3 feet thick. The other settlers watched him. They stopped their wagons on the rutted track that passed his land and stared. They saw a man building a fortress where a home should be, a tomb against the wide-open sky. They saw wasted effort, wasted time, and a profound misunderstanding of how to live in this new world. They saw a fool. Their talk in the small trading post was a low hum of pity and ridicule. The structure rising on Richter's land earned a name, spoken first as a joke, and then as a fact. They called it Richter's Folly. What did this quiet German stonemason, a man with calluses from a different kind of hardship, understand about survival that every seasoned pioneer, every skilled carpenter had missed? The answer would be written not in wood or stone, but in the brutal, unforgiving language of a Dakota winter. If you believe in the power of forgotten wisdom, hit that subscribe button right now and join us for more stories of when the old ways proved their worth. The problem in this part of the world was simple. It was the cold. But to call it cold was an insult to its terrible power. It was not a season. It was a predator. It was an active, malevolent force that seeped through the thickest logs, found every chink in the mud daubing, and hunted the warmth of every living thing. Winter began not with the first snow, but with a change in the quality of the light. The sun, even at its zenith, seemed distant and powerless. The wind that swept across the plains was born in the Arctic, and it arrived with no mountains or forests to break its charge. It was a physical blow, a constant pressure that stole the heat from a man's body in minutes. The settlers fought it with the only tools they knew. They built log cabins, the symbol of the American frontier. They were taught by experience, by the men who had come a generation before them. You felled the straightest, thickest timber you could find. You notched the logs with precision, fitting them together until the walls were a solid mass of wood. You filled the gaps with a mixture of mud, straw, and moss. The master of this craft in their small settlement was a man named Elias Vance. Vance had built more than half the structures in the county. He could raise a cabin in a week that was tight, square, and sturdy. His axe work was a form of art, his joints so clean they looked machined. He was a respected man, his wisdom as solid as the oak he favored. His cabins were the best money could buy or labor could raise, and they were failing. Not catastrophically, not all at once. They failed slowly, expensively, painfully. The cold laid siege to them. A rime of frost would form on the interior walls, a delicate, beautiful lacework of ice that was a harbinger of misery. It grew thickest on the north-facing wall, the one that never saw the winter sun. Families burned through their woodpiles at a terrifying rate. A winter's supply, cut and stacked through the sweat of late summer, could vanish by January. The fire in the hearth became a demanding tyrant, needing to be fed constantly, yet its heat was a fleeting comfort. 10 feet from the flames, the air was frigid. Water barrels froze solid. Ink turned to black ice in its wells. Life became a shrunken, huddled existence. Families lived in a small radius around the fire, their world constricted to a few square feet of warmth. At night, they piled every blanket and animal hide they owned onto their beds, but the cold still found them. They would wake to the feeling of their own breath having crystallized on the rough wool of their blankets. This was survival, but it was a grim, draining affair. It wore down the body and the spirit. Klaus Richter knew a different kind of cold. He had been raised in the Bavarian Alps, in a village nestled in a high valley where winter was a 9-month siege. There, the enemy was not just the wind, but the stone of the mountains themselves, which held a deep, penetrating chill. Yet the homes of his youth were not miserable places. They were stone houses, centuries old, that held a deep, steady warmth through the darkest months. He had been apprenticed as a stonemason, learning a trade that was as much about physics as it was about shaping rock. He learned that wood was a fast fuel. It gave its heat up quickly and was gone. Stone was different. Stone was patient. It was slow to warm, but it was also slow to cool. It held heat like a reservoir. The old masons had a saying, "Wood warms you once when you burn it. Stone warms you all winter long." When he arrived in Dakota and saw the log cabins, he was perplexed. He saw men building with the best material they had, but in a way that defied its nature. A log wall, even a thick one, was a poor barrier against the relentless Dakota wind. Wood simply didn't have the mass. It couldn't absorb and hold the day's meager heat to fight the long, cold night. The settlers were in a constant, losing battle, trying to pour heat into a leaky vessel. Klaus understood the core of the problem. They were fighting the cold from the inside out, burning fuel to push the cold away. His experience taught him to do the opposite. You did not fight the cold. You stored the warmth. You built a fortress not of defense, but of conservation. You built a thermal battery. And for that, you needed mass. You needed stone. And so he began his work, ignoring the curious stares and the whispers that followed him. He was not just building a house. He was conducting an experiment based on centuries of forgotten knowledge. He was preparing for a war he knew was coming. And he was forging his armor from the very soil his neighbors cursed. The construction of Richter's Folly became a source of local entertainment. Men would ride out to his claim on a Sunday afternoon just to watch the strange German work. What they saw baffled them. First, he laid a foundation far wider than any cabin required. It was a massive footprint of stone, dug deep into the prairie earth. Then, the walls began to rise, and the true madness of his design became clear. He was not building a single wall. He was building two. He painstakingly erected an outer wall of the largest, flattest fieldstones he could find, fitting them with the patient skill of a mosaic artist. The mortar was a mix of clay, sand, and lime he burned himself in a makeshift kiln. This outer wall rose, thick and formidable, nearly 2 feet wide. But then, he started another wall, parallel to the first, on the inside. This inner wall was made of smaller, more uniform stones. Between the two walls, he left a gap of about 6 inches, a hollow space running the entire perimeter of the house. To the onlookers, this was the height of absurdity. A hollow wall? It was a waste of space, a waste of mortar, a waste of labor. Elias Vance, the master carpenter, finally felt compelled to intervene. He respected hard work, and Richter was clearly a hard worker, but he was also a man leading his family toward disaster. Vance rode out one afternoon, dismounting and approaching Klaus with the quiet authority of a man who knows his craft. "Richter," he began, his tone more concerned than condescending. "I've been watching you build. I don't mean to pry, but I feel I must say something." Klaus stopped his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He nodded for Vance to continue. "These walls," Vance said, gesturing with a hand that knew the heft of an axe. "They're stone. In this country, stone sweats. The moment you get a fire going inside, the warmth will hit that cold rock and water will pour down the inside. Your cabin will be a damp, icy cave all winter." It was a sound, logical argument, based on real-world experience with stone cellars and foundations. Klaus considered this. "The inner wall will not be cold," he said simply, his English thick with his native accent. Vance frowned, not understanding. "And this gap," he pressed on, pointing to the hollow space. "You're building a home for mice and drafts. The wind will get in there and you'll have a river of cold air circling your house. It defeats the whole purpose of a thick wall." "The air is not for drafts," Klaus replied, his patience unwavering. "The air is a blanket." Vance shook his head. He had seen enough. This was not just unconventional, it was wrong. It violated the known principles of building in this climate. And the thickness, man. You're losing a quarter of your living space to stone. You'll have a fortress on the outside and a closet on the inside. You're working yourself to the bone for a house that will be cold, damp, and small. Klaus Richter looked at the respected carpenter, a man of proven skill and good intentions. He then looked at the rising walls of his home, and at the small sod house where his wife and 2 young children were waiting. He gave the only answer he felt was necessary. "I am trying to keep my family warm." The conversation was over. Vance left, convinced the German was a stubborn fool. He told the story at the trading post, not out of malice, but as a cautionary tale. His expert opinion sealed the community's judgment. The project was no longer just foolish, it was dangerously so. The name Richter's Folly stuck fast. As autumn deepened, Klaus continued his work. He filled the 6-inch air gap between the stone walls not with drafts, but with dried moss and straw, packing it down until it was a dense, springy layer of insulation. He was building a composite wall, an outer stone layer for mass, an inner layer of insulation, and an inner stone layer for more mass. He then built a massive central hearth, a true Rumford-style fireplace, but with a critical addition. He channeled the flue through the very heart of the stonework, a winding, serpentine path. The hot smoke and gases would not rush straight up and out. They would be forced on a long journey through the stone, surrendering their heat to the thermal mass before they were allowed to escape. The floor was not packed earth or rough-hewn planks laid on the ground. He raised it, creating a crawl space beneath. Through this space, he ran a carefully designed duct from a low opening on the south-facing wall to the base of the hearth. The house was designed to breathe, but only in the way he commanded it to. By the first snowfall, the house was complete. It was a low, solid structure, hunkered down against the prairie. Its small, deep-set windows looked like the eyes of a suspicious animal. It was strange. It was formidable, and everyone in the valley believed it would become a tomb of ice. The system Klaus had built was not just a house, it was an engine. It was a passive machine for capturing and storing energy. The principle was simple, but its application was elegant. The outer wall, a formidable 2 feet of solid granite, was the shield. Its job was to absorb the initial shock of the wind and the cold. But its primary thermal purpose was to act as a massive heat sink. On any day the sun shone, even a weak winter sun, that stone would slowly, imperceptibly, gather thermal energy. It was a giant, slow-charging battery. The 6-inch gap packed with moss and straw was the insulator. This was the part Vance and the others had completely misunderstood. They saw a gap for cold. Klaus saw a barrier. The air trapped within the organic material was a terrible conductor of heat. This layer's job was to dramatically slow the transfer of heat from the inside to the outside, or cold from the outside to the inside. It decoupled the inner wall from the outer. The inner wall of stone was the heart of the system. This was the family's reservoir of warmth. When the central hearth was burning, the serpentine flue heated this inner mass of stone from the inside out. The stone soaked up the heat, becoming a gentle, radiant source of warmth, long after the fire had died down to embers. Unlike a log wall, which cooled almost as soon as the fire did, this stone wall would radiate heat for hours, even days. The raised floor and the air duct completed the engine. The duct brought in a steady, controlled stream of fresh air from outside. This air, being cold and dense, would travel along the floor of the crawl space. But as it neared the massive hot stone foundation of the hearth, it would begin to warm. This pre-warmed air would then be drawn up into the fire, providing perfect combustion without creating a cold draft across the floor. The family wasn't living with icy air rushing in through cracks in the walls to feed the hungry fire. The house was breathing through a lung of its own. It was a complete thermal system, massed to store heat, insulation to protect it, and a controlled ventilation system that preheated the incoming air. Klaus hadn't built a simple shelter. He had built a machine for living, a machine his neighbors saw only as a pile of rocks. Then December came. It arrived not as a gentle slide into winter, but as a sudden, violent slam. An Arctic high-pressure system, a monster of dense, frigid air, broke free from its polar prison and descended upon the northern plains. The old-timers called it a Siberian Express. The temperature drop was biblical. At dawn on the first day, the thermometer at the trading post read 10 degrees Fahrenheit, a cold but manageable day. By sunset, it read -5. The wind picked up, a low moan that quickly rose to a piercing shriek. By the morning of the second day, the mercury in the thermometer had retreated to -20. The world outside had become an alien planet. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, searing the lungs. Any exposed skin was frostbitten in minutes. The very trees groaned, their sap frozen solid, their trunks splitting with a sound like a rifle shot. This was no longer winter. This was a siege. It was the test that no one had asked for, but one that would render an undeniable verdict. Inside the conventional log cabins, the battle for survival began in earnest. The fires, which had been kept burning steadily, now had to be stoked into roaring infernos. The consumption of wood was horrifying. Families were burning through a week's worth of firewood in a single day. The tightest cabins, even the ones built by Elias Vance, felt porous. The wind, driven by a pressure gradient that felt like a physical weight, forced its way through the smallest imperfections. It screamed through the daubing and whistled around the window frames. The frost on the north walls was no longer a delicate lace. It was a thick, creeping sheet of ice. Life shrank to a space of inches. Families huddled together, wrapped in every layer they owned, their backs freezing while their faces roasted. The simple act of fetching more wood from the pile just outside the door was a dangerous expedition. The misery was palpable. The constant gnawing cold was inescapable. Elias Vance was a proud man, but he was not a fool. His own house, one he had built for his family with his own skilled hands, was losing the war. He had burned through a shocking amount of his wood pile. The interior temperature, despite a constantly roaring fire, hovered just above freezing. His wife and children were huddled under a mountain of blankets, their faces pale and drawn. He looked at the thick layer of ice coating his north wall, the very wall he had so carefully notched and sealed. He thought of his conversation with the German. He remembered his own confident predictions. A damp, icy cave. He had been so certain. Now his own home felt like a damp, icy cave. A gnawing worry began to creep into his mind, colder than the wind outside. What if he was wrong? What if Richter, in his stubborn foolishness, had actually built something that worked? The thought was unsettling to his professional pride, but it was quickly replaced by a much darker fear. What if the German's folly had failed as spectacularly as he had predicted? With walls of stone that sweat in a cold this profound, the interior could become a literal tomb of ice. The family, with 2 small children, might not have the strength to fight it. They might be freezing to death, trapped inside the very fortress their father had built to protect them. The guilt was a sharp pang. He, the respected expert, had stood by and let a man make a fatal mistake. He had offered his advice, been rebuffed, and then walked away, content in his superior knowledge. By the third day, the temperature bottomed out. The official reading at the rail depot 10 miles away was minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was a constant gale-force blizzard. It was a storm that would be spoken of for generations. Elias Vance could stand it no longer. Pride be damned. A family might be in peril. He bundled himself in every piece of wool and fur he owned until he was a shapeless mound. He told his wife he was going to check on the Richters. She looked at him as if he were mad, but she saw the resolve in his eyes. The journey was a nightmare. The distance was less than a mile, but it felt like a polar expedition. The wind was a solid wall that he had to lean his entire body into. The snow was driven with such force it felt like being sandblasted. His beard froze solid within a minute. His eyelashes collected ice, and he had to constantly clear them to see. He navigated by memory, stumbling from one landmark to the next. The world was a white, howling chaos. More than once, he thought of turning back. But the image of those two small children, trapped in an ice cave, pushed him forward. Finally, he saw it. A low, dark shape against the swirling white. Richter's Folly. It was half buried in a drift, looking more like a natural rock outcropping than a house. There was no sign of panic. There was no desperate plume of smoke pouring from the chimney, which he had expected from a family burning everything they could to stay alive. In fact, the smoke rising from the stone chimney was thin, almost lazy, a calm, steady wisp in the heart of the maelstrom. It didn't make sense. He staggered to the door, his body screaming with cold. He banged his mittened fist against the thick wood, the sound swallowed by the wind. He waited. Nothing. He banged again, harder, shouting against the roar. The door swung inward, and Elias Vance was struck by a physical force. It was not a push or a blow. It was a wave of silent, steady, radiant warmth. It rolled over him, melting the ice in his beard, prickling his frozen cheeks with pins and needles. The air that flowed out of the cabin was not the superheated, dry air of a roaring fire, but a gentle, humid warmth that smelled of baking bread and wood smoke and something else. Normalcy. He stumbled inside, pulling the heavy door shut against the storm. For a moment, he was blind, his eyes struggling to adjust from the white chaos outside to the calm light within. And then he saw it. The scene before him was so profoundly, impossibly normal that it felt like a hallucination. Klaus Richter was sitting at a small wooden table, mending a piece of leather harness. He was in his shirt sleeves. His wife, Anna, stood near the hearth, a dusting of flour on her apron, sliding a loaf of bread from a small oven built into the stone. And the two small children were on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. They were barefoot. On a day when the territory was frozen to nearly 50 degrees below zero, the Richter children were playing barefoot on a stone floor. Vance stood there, a frozen statue shedding snow and ice onto the clean floor, his mind unable to process the sensory data. There was no frost on the walls. None. The small, deep-set windows were clear, showing only the swirling snow outside. He could feel the warmth radiating not just from the hearth, but from the very walls themselves. He took off a mitten and, with a sense of religious dread, placed his bare hand on the interior stone wall. It was not just not cold. It was warm. It felt like a sun-baked rock in late afternoon. A deep, penetrating, life-giving warmth was pouring out of the stone itself. Klaus looked up from his work, his expression calm, not surprised. "Elias," he said, with a simple nod, It is a bad storm. Vance could not speak. He was an expert. His entire identity was built on understanding how to build, how to survive, and everything he knew was being dismantled in this small, warm room. He walked over to the hearth. The fire was not a raging inferno. It was a small, contented fire of just 2 logs burning slowly, steadily. "Your wood," Vance finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. "How much wood have you burned?" Klaus gestured to a small wood box near the hearth. It was neat, and about 3/4 full. "I brought that in 2 days ago," he said. "It will last maybe 2 more." The numbers clicked into place in Vance's mind with the force of a physical blow. The Richters were using less wood in a day than his own family was burning in 2 hours. And they were not just surviving. They were comfortable. They were living. He, the expert, was miserably huddled in a freezing box, burning a forest to keep from dying. This immigrant, this fool, was in his shirt sleeves, in a home that was actively radiating heat, powered by a gentle fire. Vance looked from the barefoot children to the warm walls, to the small, calm fire. He looked at the quiet confidence on Klaus Richter's face. The evidence was not just present, it was overwhelming. It was inarguable. He turned to face the German stonemason. The words felt heavy in his mouth, an admission of a failure so complete it shook him to his core. But they had to be said. "Klaus," he said, his voice clear and steady, "I was wrong." He paused, letting the weight of the confession settle in the warm air. This house, it is not a folly. It is a miracle. I was wrong. Will you teach me how it works? When the great blizzard of '83 finally broke, the stories began to circulate. They were hushed at first, then incredulous. The story of Elias Vance's journey to Richter's Folly and what he found there became the talk of the territory. Vance, a man whose pride was as solid as an oak beam, became Klaus Richter's most fervent apostle. He did not just admit his error, he proclaimed it. He described the barefoot children and the warm stone walls to anyone who would listen. He used his own credibility, his reputation as the best builder in the region, to shatter the community's skepticism. He told them, "We have been fighting the cold. Richter does not fight it. He stores the warmth. We have been building tents out of logs. He has built a furnace out of stone." That spring, no new log cabins were built in the valley. Instead, men started hauling stone. They came to Klaus Richter, not with ridicule, but with respect. They came with questions, with notebooks, with a humbling desire to learn. Klaus, who had never sought vindication, shared his knowledge freely. He explained the concept of the double wall, the importance of the insulation gap, the design of the serpentine flue. He didn't gloat or remind them of their mockery. He simply taught. His satisfaction was not in being right, but in knowing that other families would be safe. Elias Vance was his first and best student. The carpenter's mind, once freed from the prison of convention, eagerly grasped the new principles. He began to combine his skill with wood with Klaus's knowledge of stone, designing hybrid houses that were easier to build but incorporated the same thermal mass principles. The transformation of the settlement was slow, but profound. The new homes, which became known simply as Richter houses, changed the very nature of winter. It was no longer a season of grim survival. Families had more fuel, more time, more comfort. The health of the community improved. Fewer children were lost to winter illnesses. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human dignity. It was the ability for a family to use their entire home in January, not just the 2 feet around the stove. It was the peace of mind of knowing that you had enough fuel to last until the spring thaw. It was in the simple, profound luxury of a child being able to play on a warm floor while a blizzard raged outside. Klaus Richter never became rich or famous. He remained a quiet stonemason. But his legacy was written into the very landscape, in the solid, low-slung stone houses that stood firm against the Dakota wind, a testament to the quiet man who listened to the wisdom of the old world and built a fortress of warmth. The story of Klaus Richter is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most innovative solutions are not new discoveries, but old wisdom, patiently reapplied. It speaks to the danger of conventional thinking and the arrogance of dismissing an idea simply because it is unfamiliar. Tradition is a powerful guide, but when it fails, true progress belongs to those who are willing to question everything, to face ridicule, and to trust in the quiet logic of stone, wind, and fire. The principles behind Richter's folly are not magic. They are the foundational concepts of modern building science. What he built was a super-insulated, high-thermal mass structure with a heat recovery ventilation system. We use different materials today: foam insulation instead of moss, triple-pane windows, and high-efficiency heat exchangers, but the core idea of storing energy within the building's envelope remains one of the most powerful tools for creating comfortable, energy-efficient homes. If this story of frontier ingenuity has earned your respect, hit that like button to help us share it. And subscribe to this channel for more forgotten history that holds lessons for today. What's the most clever piece of old-world wisdom you've ever encountered? Let us know in the comments below. The account you have just heard is a fictionalized narrative created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physics principles of thermal mass, insulation, and passive heat storage are very real and have been used in historical and modern construction, the specific characters, names, locations, and events depicted in this story are products of creative storytelling. This narrative is intended to be an accessible illustration of these technical concepts and should not be taken as a literal historical record or as professional construction advice. Always consult with qualified professionals for any building projects.